Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we're going to have a bit of a serious conversation. So, for those of you who don't follow me on other forms of social media, a couple of days ago now I announced the title of my first book, which is coming out from Llewellyn in December of 2021. I'm super, super excited about it. I'm really proud of this book. And the book is called Qabalah for Wiccans. Um, and so I shared the title, I shared the cover art, which is really beautiful, and just sort of made a public announcement that this is the book that I've written, this is when it's coming out. It's not available for pre-order yet, I'm just sort of putting it out there. And pretty much as soon as I made that announcement, there was a massive backlash, largely on Facebook, of people who um, felt that it was culturally appropriative for a non-Jewish person, and moreover a Wiccan, to be writing about the Kabbalah. And that's an understandable sentiment, that's an understandable concern. And so I wanted to take a little bit of time today and just talk through sort of Wicca and its relationship to Kabbalah, and the complicated history of Kabbalah in occultism and the problem of cultural appropriation, and sort of where all of that sits relative to this book that I've written. Because, a lot of people have this impression that, I'm trying to sort of capitalize on the culture of marginalized people, and that I'm being predatory and swooping in. And, that is an understandable and legitimate concern to have. And it is my responsibility as an author to prove myself to you, and to sort of justify my project and explain what I'm doing and why. And there are a lot of people who are going to feel that it's never okay for a non-Jewish person to talk about Kabbalah. And that's an understandable criticism. That's an okay criticism. It's okay for people to have that boundary. But I want to talk through a little bit of sort of what this book is and why I wrote it, why I felt that it needed to be written. So to start out with, right, Kabbalah is an appropriation of Jewish mystical practices. There is no question about that. There's no getting around that, right? So the Kabbalah, sort of more or less as it exists in modern Judaism today, emerged in medieval Iberia, right? It has its roots further back. It also sort of is a syncretic blend of other sort of mystical and philosophical traditions that predated it, including some non-Jewish ones, right? That the various influences converged and formed the sort of Kabbalah that people might be familiar with today, starting in the Middle Ages in Iberia. And pretty much as soon as Kabbalah emerged, Christian mystics sort of took it and said, "This is mine now." And that was particularly given the deeply anti-Semitic climate of medieval Europe and the Mediterranean. It's important to understand that that was a violent and harmful thing, right? This was part of a documented, concerted effort to eradicate Jewish culture by diluting it, by dissolving it into Christianity, by sort of making it indistinguishable from Christianity, and trying to appeal to Jewish people to get them to convert by sort of telling them that, everything in Judaism was already in Christianity as well. So there's a really deeply troubling anti-Semitic history to, right off the bat, the appropriation of Kabbalah by non-Jewish mystics. That's unquestionable, right? That is a historical fact. And over the course of time, the Christian appropriation of Kabbalah worked its way into the larger Western occult community, and it became pervasive and incredibly influential, right? So you see Kabbalah not just in the works of Aleister Crowley and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, but you see it much earlier. You see it with Eliphas Levi. You see it with Cornelius Agrippa, right? The 3 books of occult philosophy have explicitly Kabbalistic magic worked into them. You see it in some versions of Goetia, although a lot of that is, it's hard to disentangle because MacGregor Mathers had a great deal of influence on translating some of those works. But even so, like the fact that there are 72 demons conjured in the Lesser Key of Solomon, that's an explicitly Kabbalistic thing that has to do with the Shem HaMfarash. So Kabbalah was stolen. Kabbalah was appropriated from Jewish practice very early on, and then it just sort of became a pervasive part of Western occultism. And that's not to say that it's a good thing that it became a pervasive part of Western occultism, but it did. It became so deeply ingrained that it's very difficult to engage in the occult community without Kabbalah being a part of sort of the history of how your occultism got to be where it is. Um, and that's true for almost every form of modern occultism. There are some exceptions. There are some forms of occultism that remain completely untouched by Kabbalah, but most modern Western occultism has at least been influenced in some way by magical Kabbalah. And that's true of Wicca as much as much as it is true of any other magical tradition. So the occult notebooks of Wiccan figures like Gerald Gardner and Alex Sanders are filled with explicitly Kabbalistic notes. You have some works by Doreen Valiente where she talks about the Wiccan gods in Kabbalistic terms. We know that occultists like Aleister Crowley and Dion Fortune were both strongly influential on the development of early Wicca. And so there's this legacy present in Wicca of Kabbalistic symbolism. And the question that then arises as a Wiccan practitioner is, what do you do about it? Right? There's no putting that particular genie back in the bottle. Right? There's no way to practice any form of Western occultism that has been in any way influenced by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn without there being some kind of a Kabbalistic influence on what you do. And so there are two potential responses to that problem, right? One response is to say, well, if that's the case, right, Kabbalah is culturally appropriative, and so I reject anything that has been influenced by it, I tear it all down, and I start over completely, and do something completely unlike anything else that's been influenced by this magical tradition. And that's a legitimate move to make, right? That's a thing that people absolutely can do. The other approach is the approach that I tried to take in this book, which is to say, yes, like, let's talk about this extremely upsetting and violent history of sort of the appropriation of Kabbalah from its original Jewish sources, the way it was sort of twisted by Christian and then later non-Christian magical practitioners, and the way that sort of modern magical Kabbalah really doesn't look anything like Jewish Kabbalah, right? It has sort of become its own entity. And it has its roots in this appropriation of Jewish mysticism, but in fact, it's something entirely different. And the analogy that I like to use is it's like being, for those of us who are in the US, it's like being an American living on soil that was forcibly taken from indigenous tribes. So I live on land that was taken from the Lenape, and that happened. There's no undoing the violent removal of indigenous peoples from this land, right? That's a historical fact that I, as someone who now inhabits this land, have to reckon with somehow. I can't just sort of sweep it under the rug and pretend it never happened. I have to confront that history and then do my best to find a way to continue to live on this land in a way that recognizes that history and does something about it to try to begin to make reparations and to move forward in some kind of respectful way. So the purpose of the book that I've written, and I think a lot of people saw the title and made some assumptions about what the book was and what it was trying to be. The purpose of the book I've written is to say, look, occult Kabbalah is not Jewish Kabbalah. I'm very, very explicit about that, right? Occult Kabbalah is not Jewish Kabbalah, and it has its roots in the appropriation of Jewish Kabbalah, but it's not the same thing. And practicing one does not give you access to the other, because Jewish Kabbalah is a living, thriving mystical tradition that is part of a closed culture to which Gentiles don't have access or a right. But occult Kabbalah exists and is, has been a part of Western occult history since the 1300s. And we would be rewriting occult history if we pretended that it wasn't there. We can't pretend it's not there. um, because that is problematic in a different way, right? I'm not saying that it's commensurable, but it's also a problem to just sort of turn a blind eye to the way that your witchcraft or occultism or religion or what have you has been influenced by magical practices that have their roots in cultural appropriation, and in this case a fairly violent form of cultural appropriation. Um, and so occult Kabbalah is not Jewish Kabbalah, but it exists, and it was a very strong influence on early Wicca. And depending on what your Wicca looks like today, there may still be a great deal of resonance between your Wiccan theology and ritual structure and so on, and Kabbalistic concepts. And so what do you do with that? And the purpose of my book is to try to look at finding a respectful and meaningful way to talk about occult Kabbalah and its relationship to Wicca, um, while still acknowledging that Jewish Kabbalah is a living practice, is something that outsiders don't have a right to talk about, don't have a right to practice, um, and and that those two things come apart from each other. And I really do earnestly believe that occult Kabbalah, the kinds of magic that were done by figures like Aleister Crowley, S. L. McGregor Mathers, Dion Fortune, those things are a notable influence on Wicca. There can be no denying that if we look at the history of Wicca. And so what do we do with that? And my goal in the book is to say, here's what occult Kabbalah is, here's what it isn't, and here's why it might be relevant to you and how you can understand it as a Wiccan. And there are going to be some people who feel that it is inappropriate even for me to have written that. And that's okay. That's a legitimate criticism, and you're allowed. I'm not trying to say that I have the authority to give you permission, but it's understandable and it's perfectly reasonable to raise those criticisms and to ask questions and to be vigilant about cultural appropriation, right? The pagan community is situated at a point where we are collectively more attentive to and more aware of problems of cultural appropriation than we have really ever been as a community at any other point in our history. And on the whole, that's a really good thing because it's really important to think about sort of long-standing institutionalized power dynamics and the way those power dynamics play out in the things that we do, in the practices that we use, and in the things that we think we're entitled to. It's really important to have those conversations. But it's also, I think, important to understand that some things are part of our history, and that history is complicated and messy and often problematic. And we shouldn't just pretend that those bad, appropriative, violent parts of our history never happened. For me, the way forward is to talk about that, talk about the roots of occult Kabbalah, understand where they come from, do our best to be respectful of the continuing Jewish tradition that exists, that occult Kabbalah was originally stolen from, but not try to sort of whitewash away this thing that is sort of a major historical feature and a major influence on the way that a lot of people continue to practice today, just because we don't want to acknowledge that it had an effect on us. So, it's a complicated conversation. And there are going to be people who are still upset and are still unsatisfied with what I have to say. And, that's okay. I don't want to silence criticism. I think criticism is important. I think having a dialogue is really important. But this way, at least, if you continue to be upset with me, if you continue to feel that the concept of this book is culturally appropriative, at the very least, you're doing that on the basis of what I'm actually saying, and not necessarily on the basis of assumptions that you might have made about what the book is or what I'm trying to say in it, or that I'm trying to profit off of a marginalized culture. I promise you, if I were trying to make a profit off of a marginalized culture, there would be many more lucrative ways to do it than writing a book on Kabbalah. I'm not going to make a lot of money off of this. I promise you. I'm not doing it for the money. I wrote this book because I felt like it was a conversation that the Wiccan community needed to have. It was a book that didn't already exist. And I was really troubled, in part, by the anti-Semitism that exists in a lot of extant Kabbalah books, and the way that sort of the troublesome history of the occult's relationship with Kabbalah is often glossed over. And that was something that I really explicitly wanted to address. So that's about all I have to say. And if you've made it this far, thank you for listening, and I will see you on the flip side. For those who are interested, I'll continue to write and talk. I have my blog where I will continue to publish things over the course of the intervening 11 months, mostly about tarot, a little bit about witchcraft, probably a little bit about Kabbalah as well. And I will share my social media links down below in case you're interested. So thank you so much, and have a good week. Bye.